Welcome everyone to our September webinar, Staying Ahead of Your Client or Getting Ahead of Your Client, whichever it might be. Let's just perhaps take a moment first to understand the context. Why do we bother running these webinars at VCO? The core reason for our existence is to defend high quality professional services. As somebody put it recently, it's about inspiration at work, not perspiration at work, a distinction that really worked with me. And unfortunately, in many professional circles at the moment, the value of professional services is under attack. So we have many forces around, which we don't have to go into, often pushing down the value of what we do, causing us perhaps to be boxed in as servants to sophisticated buyers rather than their partners. So the vision here, if you like, is a workplace in which we can enjoy what we're doing, where we can feel a partner with our clients, where there's fun and where we look forward to going to work. As a friend put it last week, it's business development isn't just a commercial venture, it's also a human adventure. And that's very much a big part of what we're about here, raising the value of what we do, but also perhaps empowering ourselves as we do so. This particular series focuses on business development with express view to put you ahead of your clients. So there's different themes running through it. All of them contain actionable items that hopefully you can put into your task list or your Trello board or your pre-client checklist or whatever it is that you've got. Today's webinar is how to stay ahead of the client. The next one is on the subject of charging fees, and it's very much about not charging daily or hourly rates. That's on October the 17th. And then we're going to explore, 2 weeks later, we're going to explore how we keep in touch with people in a way that's human friendly, not just GDPR compliant. That's the key focus of that. And on each of the webinars, hopefully, I'm introducing a special guest. And today's special guest is Carmen Marrero. Carmen and I first met only a few months ago on these webinars, actually, I think in January, if I remember rightly. Carmen is based in London. She works as a marketing and communications consultant with a particular focus on public relations. And rather than me telling you what Carmen does, Carmen, would you like to briefly tell us what you do?
Thank you very much. So yeah, as John has mentioned, we have been working together now for a few months. I work on business-to-business marketing primarily with consultancies, and they tend to be companies that provide services primarily in the creative industry, some of them in technology. And what I do is I try to focus on the key sources of new business for them, which no doubt are reputation and networks.
Thanks, Carmen. And I guess most people on the call know what I do, but just in case I've missed that, I work with consultants like Carmen and others to raise the value of what they do, to help them position themselves in a better way with their clients, to charge more money, to be able to raise their fees as a function of the value of what they do, and also to energize ourselves in business development, because as I said earlier, it's a human adventure as much as it's a commercial venture. Today's agenda is going to start with a little preamble as to why it's important to get ahead and some of the things that no longer constitute staying ahead. We're going to spend about 5-10 minutes on that and incorporating into that the all-important client perspective. And I'll invite you to step into the client's shoes in the moment in the form of a poll. And then for roughly 45 minutes, we go through the practical tips, very specific examples of how and when you can show that you are a step ahead, and Carmen is going to help me with that. And there's an important piece at the end where we apply it to existing clients. So it's true that in the first part of the call, we're going to be looking more at prospective clients, because clearly how the relationship begins is all important. But as the call goes on, we look at how we apply this to existing clients. From time to time, you'll see my eye is going in that direction. That's me keeping an eye out from questions from you or anything you'd like to incorporate in. If I cannot answer them on the call, we'll go through the question log at the end, and I may get in touch with some of you separately. Okay, Why is it important to be a step ahead? Let me give you 3 reasons. Top of the list is you will build trust faster with a client if you can show them that you've done this type of work before and actually you know what needs to be done even better than they do. That puts you a step ahead. As long as you do that well, then it builds trust and you become their partner rather than their servant. The second reason, and it's the tangible one that you can measure, and hopefully Carmen already has, is that you can charge more for your services, often significantly more, when you are the person guiding the client rather than just doing what they tell you. And the third reason is it will set you apart from all the other providers, and let's face it, we're all in crowded markets, where other suppliers are also claiming to do the same, or, and it's not just the external suppliers here, the number one competitor most of us have is what I call DIY. What is DIY? Doing it yourself, doing it in-house. For many of us in the B2B space, the principal competitor isn't another consultant or another accounting practice or so on. It's actually somebody trying to do this in-house themselves, or by hiring an intern or whatever it might be. Somebody's asking about slides. Yes, we share the slides and the replay after the call, Camilla. Okay, where does this fit? As some of you will know, we work through a very structured 7-step approach in the coaching work that I do with the professional clients, which is mapped out there, which I am not going to go through today because that's not the purpose of our call. But for those of you who are already familiar with that 7-step structure towards value-centered selling and higher fees, then what we're focusing on today primarily fits into the first 3 steps. So the first step, as part of your preparation, particularly as part of your insight preparation, some of you will know what that means, we're going to practice some specific sentence stems that you can put onto your pre-client checklist, so that when you go to a meeting, or for that matter, an interview, then you are equipped to ask certain questions. We're going to practice a skill called making space for discovery questions, because if we cannot make the space to ask those questions, we just end up being interviewed by the client, and then you got no chance of showing that you're ahead of them. We're going to talk about reframing and specifically suggesting and how to suggest a change to requirements. And again, Carmen will help to illustrate some of that. And then towards the end, we'll look at some key moments in a current client relationship and some of the little things you can do at the end of meetings, for example, to show them that you are a step ahead. Okay, let's talk briefly about what's no longer enough. I think we've long passed the point at which quoting qualifications to a client constitutes being a step ahead. At the point that everybody who comes through the door has an MBA, then it's actually quite hard to use qualifications to get ahead of the pack. I think likewise, just claiming that you can look after things for the client in itself, everybody claims that, so no surprise. More controversially, perhaps, for those who've been taught to tell success stories as part of their positioning or as part of their selling technique, I would argue that unless that success story has an express teaching point in it, it's better avoided. And I will say the same about case studies, at least on their own. And I will even more controversially maybe, and perhaps this is a point that will apply to more people today, I would also make the suggestion that any claim about your unique methodology in itself is no longer enough to put you ahead of a client. And finally, and Carmen, this phrase comes directly from you, this phrase straight to brief delivery, which I learned from you only a few weeks ago. Would you like to comment on that? Don't forget.
I didn't know you were picking that up. Well done.
I'm listening. listening.
Well done. Excellent. No, yeah, so I suppose that talks about going back to the idea of partner versus servant. So something I've realized myself, and I'll give an example in a minute, is that as a consultant, you are a good consultant because you provide a service. And as such, you are a service-oriented person, and a solution-led person. You want to help these people. So a couple of weeks back, I had one of my existing clients, and they wanted to expand their business into a whole new area. In this case, from a design agency to a publication business. The deadlines are always very short. We had an exhibition and a book being published, and immediately my natural temptation is to go into, okay, so you want to do this, how are we going to do it? And that movement to the how. So effectively you are taking the brief, but the challenge there, of course, is the big question is the why. Why are we launching this publication business? Why does it need to be done in, say, 3 weeks? I mean, in the end, we did come up with a strategy, but I had to force myself, I suppose, not to go straight into delivery or straight into you're briefing me with a problem, let me find a solution. So it'd be great to hear what other people think about this. But
it's a great point. And we often feel good, don't we, when a client, I think I might ask you to go on mute, Carmen, because I'm getting my voice back from your microphone. When we hear a client that actually wants a requirement, we often are quite enthusiastic. So we naturally, the temptation is to step into straight to brief delivery. And I think what you very neatly illustrated there is before we do so, just ask a few why questions first, because the why will probably influence the how, and the why in itself is a way to help get ahead of your client. Okay, speaking of client, first time on Demio, they didn't have this function 6 months ago. Let's see how this goes. Bear with me a moment. When you are the client, hopefully you are seeing a screen in front of you to this effect. When you are the client, what do you most value? So let's take an example. Suppose that tomorrow you want a website done or something else like that, and you have a professional in front of you, or more likely on Skype or on Zoom these days. What do you want them telling you about? What specifically do you value as being a step ahead? That's the question. Is it the stories? Is it their viewpoint on what you're doing? Is it experience from similar projects? Is it a professional trying to prove something? Whatever the something is. Demio only gives you 5 options. We could have done with 10 on this one. Or is it a lot of information, or I might argue a lot of questions, because there's 2 variations on that. Okay. I think we've got an 80%. That's probably in a representative sample, and I don't really have to comment further. I think on. Can I just check you're seeing a screen in front of you that has all the results? Hopefully you are. There's a pretty. I mean, it's a massive vote, clearly for the third option. Not a big surprise, and yet. Isn't it interesting that when we're on the other side of the fence, when we're the supplier, what we can do is we step into that 5th option there, which is giving the customer a lot of information, or quoting TED Talks, or referring to books we've read. I'm not suggesting that you would do this, but a lot of professionals do. I don't know about you, but personally, if I hear, one more person interrupting a very interesting conversation about requirements with, let me tell you about this TED Talk I saw last week. You're just like, please don't, email it after maybe. But what we want to hear about when we are customers is experience of similar projects, risks to watch out for, things that need to be taken that they wish had been taken into account on day one, suggestions for how to set it up, etc. Point made, I think. Let's move on. So that client perspective, right on time, gives us a clue as to the sorts of practical tips that are going to follow. Here's a few items for your checklist. Now, you will get the slides tomorrow, but if you want to write it down some of these today and think about them, you probably can do yourself a favor. Here, I put them all on the screen. You can choose your favorite ones. There may be ones you like or don't like. And what I would love to hear is oh, I'm getting messages that says you can't see the poll results. Oops, hang on a second. How do I share the poll results? One sec, bear with me a second. First time I've done this. Learning curve climbing as we speak. Share results with attendees. Share, how's that? That's a new poll. Okay, my failure, folks. All right, here's what the results said. A massive, like 80% voted for option 3. I forgot to tick a box, so you didn't see the results. I'm sorry about that. Point made for next time. Okay, coming back to the practical tips, because that's the core of today's call. First tip is have some of these sentences ready for any meeting you go into. So if you have a meeting at 2 o'clock this afternoon, then as you drive there, you should be able to ask, how are you dealing with type question? Or has your planning taken account of ... Better still, how has your planning taken account of GDPR, whatever. The how question is better than the has the question because it's an open question. Any favorites that you ask? How about you, Carmen?
The how are you dealing with is quite a good one. One of my, for example, like when I work a lot with consultancies, as I mentioned, and that means that they normally bill on time and time and materials, as they say. So when it comes to looking at their reputation, they really, one of the biggest struggles is the fact that they cannot allocate the resources internally to things that are not billable to clients.
Right.
And so I have used that a version, not exactly with this wording, but I find that quite interesting. So how are you dealing with the fact that your team will be mostly engaged with client work most of the time?
Okay. Any particular situation that in the context of public relations that the clients just tend to forget about?
The world of public relations is not an easy one. So hopefully some good examples here. So one of the, many examples, like recently doing having an initial conversation with a client, not yet a client at the time, but talking about potential PR launch. They often don't know how journalists work and how publications work, and that things take 6 weeks to prepare. So that's an interesting one for them because they're normally geared towards the pace of their clients, but not necessarily the pace of the journalists they want to reach.
Right. Okay, so one of the complications that you can introduce to any client is the typical timeline to which a journalist is working.
The mindset of the journalist as part of that.
Right. Okay. Cool. That's an example of, so one of the, if we want to turn that into one of the sentence stems there. So one of the complications that we often face in a launch project is that companies don't actually understand how it is that journalists work, and in particular, the kind of timescales that they're operating to. When a company understands that, then they're in a better position to work with the journalist. Or rehearsing the second one, from my experience, the top 3 risks faced with a launch project is 1, 2, 3. That's a great way to grab attention. Or if you're in program management, or you're in web design, or you're in training and development, the top 3 risks faced by anyone buying this type of service is ABC. I would suggest having that ready, tailored, and bringing that in with you to any client meeting, even before the meeting happens. already psychologically puts you ahead. Even if the meeting goes differently, psychologically you're in the right place. Okay, let's move along. In all of this, as I mentioned earlier, the key to success is being the customer's partner and not just their servant. Okay, let's talk this through in practice a bit, Carmen. So in the context of PR, and feel free to take these points in any order. They're points you've made at various stages in our work together. What does this mean in practice? When you are in front of a prospective client, what are the practical ways, or what are the examples, if you like, that being a partner rather than a servant, what difference does that make?
Touched a bit on partner and servant, kind of work in terms of reshaping the brief, or at least questioning the brief. One of my key questions there for them is why, but also why now. Often that gives me some idea as to, is there any urgency in the business? Is there a pipeline not strong enough? Do they have something coming up in the next 2 months? So that's very useful for me. I have found that quite useful in conversations. Now, the other element that perhaps in PR is often the case is people have worked with PR agencies before and they haven't really succeeded. And although it could be tempting sometimes to highlight how other people did it wrong, the reality is that getting noticed out there in the world is not easy. So one of the techniques perhaps have been practicing since we talked about it is, acknowledging first of all the difficulty of getting noticed in the first place. So you don't gloss over the complications of the work. What I find at that point in the initial conversation with a client is that, in fact, I had a meeting last week precisely about this. They have been burnt before, and it is very refreshing for them to hear that it is not easy and that these mistakes are often made by many people and that they can be fixed, but there is no magic bullet. And this idea of not having the magic bullet, although as a consultant, sometimes you want to offer a very pretty view of the future, then, the reality is, I noticed that meeting when, the tone just changed from that point because there was an element of honesty on my part. And I suspect that the sense of trust was increased.
Absolutely. And again, you show you've been there, you show you've done the work, you're able to show the scars, if you like, you're able to say, hey, this is not easy. Precisely by highlighting the complications, we actually highlight the value of what we do. It's almost counterintuitive. You'd imagine the more you take away the complications, it would add to the value of what we do. Ironically, the reverse is usually the case. With any kind of savvy buyer who has been there already, unless they're utterly naive, they know there are complications. That's why they're reaching out to us. If it was easy, they'd have done it already in many cases. Great point. I also really echo this piece you've described about many people have been disappointed by promises given but not fulfilled. I think it's always helpful, I find, when I'm going into a meeting, particularly in the development space. Like there's a lot of positive spin in the development space. Leadership transformation, sales, wonderful rosy futures get painted. And actually being aware that this person has probably heard a rosy future story already, I certainly find to be quite helpful when going in to a meeting. So that's our preparation. So we now set foot in the meeting. One of the skills that we need to practice there is making space for some of this. Quite important skill. And the reason it's important is that we will often be put on the spot. They will start by interviewing you, particularly if there's 3 or 4 of them and one of us. That's when the pressure's on, if you like. So you will perhaps be asked how much something will cost, quite a regular one, or can you tell us your experience of ... interview, typically a typical interview question. So this is when we need to be able to come back with a question that actually allows us to make some space to ask further questions. That might mean partially answering their question in the second example. We'll talk more about that when we come to pricing next time, because often that's the question: how much is it going to cost to do X? Or how many days will it take you to do X? And what's your daily rate? More on that next week, in 2 weeks' time, the 17th of October. But what we need to be able to do is make space to ask questions back. So to do so, we have to be able to create the space. And this is how we do. You can say, for example, sure, happy to address the points you've raised. Can I just clarify something first? Why are you doing this right now? Or can I just clarify some of the operational requirements that will help me to give you at least a budget guideline, if not a quotation today? That's the ability to make space for discovery questions. But probably the number one skill of all, and remember the poll, 80% of you said what you valued was experience from similar project. If you can harness that experience to suggest a change to the way that they're going about this, then you are well on your way to showing you are ahead of your client. Whether they're an existing client or future, it almost doesn't matter. You should always be able to tweak the requirements a little bit. Why? Because it sets you up as being their partner rather than their servant. So one particular way you can do that is reorder the sequence in which they're going about the project. So maybe they're going to do A, then B, then C, and you tell them why it might be worthwhile doing B first, or doing at least B in parallel with A, because the results will give a better synthesis when we come to C. Or in many cases, for example, when in software development or in anything that involves development, actually, which can, by the way, include training, do a prototype. Accompanied with a little bit of informal research. So you reach out to some of the people to be trained or developed and create something with them. Why? Because by doing that prototype deepens your engagement and gives you early involvement with them. But most importantly, from their point of view, you can explain why that will speed up the eventual project. If they buy your reframe, they have almost certainly bought you. This is the great news here, in a sense. So if if you describe to them the sequence, a revised sequence of doing something, or something to take account of, then they've bought you as well. Any examples, Carmen, from your experience where you've tweaked requirements with customers?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think it was about a few months back when I am often approached with a brief that is very aspirational, for example, or with a discussion, I suppose, that is very aspirational in terms of we want to raise our profile, we want to raise our reputation, no one knows our work, that kind of situation. And what I have found quite useful recently is to suggest a pilot project within the remit of building the reputation, because building reputation is a long-term endeavor. And if people have been burned before, it's very difficult for them sometimes to commit to something that is going to take some time to get results from. What they find easier, what I tend to do then is see if they have a project that we can use as a pilot. So it's not really a prototype, I don't use those words, but it definitely is something I suggest. And inevitably, I mean, I would say 80% of the time in the meetings I've had in the last 2 months, it has worked.
Great.
Because people find it easier to buy something knowing that it's going to also help them shape an approach that they can take over for a long time. So that's a good one.
Yeah, a pilot. Okay, I like the word pilot, actually. I had a web development business in mind when I used prototype, but indeed pilot, I can see it to be more broadly applicable. Very interesting comment I'm reading from Terry, where he says, somebody once said a long time ago, don't make molehills out of your mountains. Absolutely. Going back, echoing back the complications theme. The last thing you want to do is diminish complications. That's called making molehills out of a mountain. Love that. Nice metaphor. Just checking in that there's a few sound messages there, but I presume somebody would have told me by now if we'd actually lost sound. So if you can all still hear me, that's good. Let's move on to some more existing clients. I think it's one thing to be talking about prospective clients, but there's maybe other moments in the client relationship when you can also show that you've been ahead. Probably the one that's most missed, as in, I would say 9 out of 10 professionals step straight over this without recognizing just how significant it is. It's the moment in which they've agreed to work with you. You know, on the day or on the week in which they've agreed to work with you, then you are at your most valuable. This is a brilliant moment to show them that you're ahead. For example, give them an unexpected item of value. Give them some early benefits coming out of the people you've contacted in order to run the pilot, or tell them how well their initial draft has been received, or whatever it is. You might well just tell them how well they're doing in comparison to other clients you've worked with. Believe it or not, clients are just as hungry for positive feedback as you might be from them. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But the day upon which, or the week upon which they've said yes, is a wonderful opportunity to ask for referrals. It's a wonderful opportunity to give them unexpected items of value. It's a wonderful opportunity to share with them a story from your experience that makes a point and that is valuable. But we often miss it. Why? Just in our enthusiasm to get started, we plow straight into the work, and sometimes we forget to give them that unexpected item of value. I've already alluded to this one. Give them positive feedback about what they're doing well. And by positive, I mean specific and I mean factual. So, you know, listen, Jim, I've worked with at least 25 organizations in the last year who have been doing a launch. And what you guys are doing really well is you've taken the time to develop your community story in-house before anything gets published. That's, you know, there's 24 other companies who probably wish they'd done that. I'm trying to think of examples in Carmen's area. Don't be shy about giving clients positive feedback. Obviously, you need to be careful. It's not that it doesn't land as patronizing. That there are risks. There's risks with everything in business development. If you're afraid of risk, stay in the car. But the point here is that don't be shy about giving specific feedback to clients and letting them know when they're doing well. Equally, and of course this no doubt is chimes with what Carmen's just been talking about, we want to give them some early warning if there are risks and threats coming up during the project. Again though, we want to be careful that feedback will be valuable and that the timing is right. So going into see somebody who's already, you know, up to here and has no time to think and just burdening them with another problem, probably that's a time to leave the molehills as molehills and not mountains. So we sometimes need to get the timing right here. Here's one that Carmen can speak to, I think. Again, there's a specific story behind this one, I think, isn't there?
Linked to, I suppose, our ambition or my ambition to always deliver a good service for clients, etc. You can look too much ahead, if I may say. It's a bit controversial, as this is the the webinar of looking ahead. But I recently had an example with a long-standing client where there are issues in the company, perhaps, that have absolutely nothing to do with the work we are doing together. Changes of senior staff, you know, people have moved on. Lots of worries in the mind of this founder. And for a couple of weeks, I was getting pretty anxious because, of course, this was also a client I've been with for 2 years. So you start to wonder next for this relationship? So a mix of these elements made me feel quite anxious about the relationship. And what I realized is, you know, also through our work, John, like, but I then practiced and I realized that actually by just focusing on the work, sometimes you are providing the best service. By actually just focusing on the project that you were hired to do and retaining that positive attitude and just getting things done in that way. In a way, it feels like it's exactly the opposite that you have been arguing, but I actually think the danger as people, we are people after all, is that if you think too much ahead and you see too much of the client environment, I started to feel paralyzed. But I mean, I don't know what you think.
Well, it's getting the balance right. It's never a mistake to focus on the work, but the work and the immediate context of the work. And a lot of this is doing the opposite to what everyone else is doing. I mean, if there's a key theme running through value-centered client development, it's do the opposite to what everyone else is doing, because that differentiates you and gives you value. So when everyone's coming in telling stories, then come in and talk about complications instead. When everyone is trying to act like a consultant, then getting on with the job actually is what differentiates you from others. So there are, it's all about judging the client context. That's the crucial skill in value. And then as part of that, doing regular reviews, but reviews not of you or of your work. This is the mistake that's often made in reviewing, in carrying out client review. The review becomes about you, or the review becomes about how well the project went. No, the review is about what has been most useful so far and what can we do better, as in what can we, the client, do better, or what can we do better together is perhaps more the point. The big risk with current clients is disappearing into, precisely because trust builds, they let us get on with the job. But when they let us get on with the job, we can become invisible. And that's the number one risk here. It's becoming invisible. The more and the longer you've been with your client and the more they trust you, their attention moves elsewhere, the value of what you're doing becomes invisible. As a result of which, not only can rates be capped, but actually they can be cut. I've worked with an amazing number of people over the last few years, particularly in the banking sector, where just, there have been mass, not just capping of rates, but actually reduction of rates, mandated. And if the program manager or if the project manager doesn't have alternate business lined up, which they obviously should be, then we can be in a situation where there's no choice left but to accept a capped rate. These are one of the reasons why calls like this are important, why business development is important, so that we don't become over-dependent on one or two clients. Because if we do, the real risk is that we get so busy with their affairs, we're just thinking too much about them. It's very, very easy to wake up in the morning and go to bed at night still thinking about a client, forgetting that, hang on a minute, they're a client. They're not your partner, they're not your life, and they're certainly not your professional identity. At the opposite end of the spectrum, as we saw on the last slide, this is all about balance, hence the tightrope in front of us. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have been too much into the networking. I worked with somebody a few years ago who came to coaching because she just lost a major project. And the reason that she lost a major project is she was doing too much networking in it. A senior manager noticed she was doing too much networking and ordered that her contract be not renewed, even though she was doing actually a pretty good job in terms of the current contract. So even though her performance was good, she ended up having her wings clipped, or in this case, not sure what the metaphor is, thrown out of the cage entirely, perhaps. Why? Because she was seen to be too avidly self-serving by networking within the organization. And it annoyed somebody sufficiently to get rid of them. But above all, and I think Liz has just echoed this on the chat, we can just start to think too much about a particular customer. That's the early warning. You know, if you're getting too worried about a particular client account, then that should be a signal, or you can make that a signal to up the ante in terms of your own business development. You know, at the end of the day, a client should be a client. And your ability to stay ahead of them and your ability to stay in charge of the customer conversation pretty much relates to keeping them in that space. So without, of course, overdoing it, you do want to meet as many stakeholders as possible as part of your current project. I'd be careful about networking beyond the brief of the current project. But as part of the current project, wherever possible, do try to meet as many stakeholders as possible. Just make sure there's a good reason for it. Make sure there's a why. You can, within that context, be curious about their opportunities and risks. Curiosity is probably one of the most powerful tools in business development. You don't have to earn the right to be curious. You already have it. You can offer helpful suggestions, but I would keep them as suggestions rather than evaluations. And again, just time them carefully. We don't necessarily want to be claiming we can help them with 10 other things on the first week in which we're in there. If only because of Liz's last point, which is the client can very quickly start to resent your abilities. Some of us come in the door with a lot more experience than the manager that's hiring us. That can turn into a subconscious or often conscious resentment if we're not careful. Where appropriate, and obviously the key word here is relevant, we can share marketplace insights. There is a bit of a tendency to overdo that at the moment, so I kind of go easy on that one. As in, the client's appetite for information may not be the same as yours. You might like reading a lot of articles, they might not. So we might want to think about what their appetite for information is before doing it. And culturally permitting, of course, you just can't beat meeting socially. Again, it's not for everyone. So again, it's all about fitness for purpose, isn't it always? Quality is fitness for purpose. But meeting socially is a great way to build connections outside of work. It is sadly one of the ways in which working parents get penalized because they're not available for some of the after work networking. And I'm always conscious of that when I'm co-creating a business development plan with somebody. Because one of the first questions I usually have to ask is, how available are you for social meetings after work? And for some people, that is an issue. I'll come back to your comment, Jeff, in a moment. It's very relevant here. But from a social perspective, it isn't just after work socializing. There is lunchtime. There is a cup of coffee. There is inviting them to something that you're going to anyway. So there are ways, perhaps, in which the personal connections can be woven in. Lots of pitfalls to avoid. Oh my God, I couldn't possibly want to cover all of those. I'm just seeing a message from Stuart. I'll have to look into that after, Stuart. But I just did see your message anyway. Jeff's comment, issues that the client often lose sight of what the norm is. And yeah, that's a very interesting question from Charlotte, by the way. I'll come back to that in a moment. The problem is that the norm changes. So if you start developing to a very high standard all the time, that becomes the norm. This is why we have to sometimes do the hidden value conversation that I've alluded to elsewhere on a different webinar, in order to let them know that actually the norm is not the norm. So it's a good point. Would I offer socializing for life coaching is a very, very good question, Charlotte. And I'm not sure that the answer is yes, because the risk is in a life coaching context, the socializing can develop into friendship, or the expectation from the client's perspective is that it develops into friendship. So again, we need to be a little careful about what the boundaries are around that. Pitfalls, apart from the one I just covered, making projects too complicated. That's why pilots are a great example. Assuming what their priorities are, well, enough said. The being rushed. There is probably not, I was going to say not a week goes by, but there's probably not a day goes by that I don't hear from some professional saying the client wants something urgently. I heard it yesterday in the context of branding. I heard it the week before in the context of a product launch. It is this urgent thing, I believe, is one of the things we want to push back on. And Carmen has given us the best tool to do so, which is asking what's driving the urgency. What's the why behind the urgency? Because being over-eager and over-enthusiastic, unfortunately, tends to leave us back in servant relationships rather than partner relationships with clients. Final comment, beware of nagging them in terms of the proposal or in terms of whether they're going ahead. Why? Because you can come across as desperate. So when you're pushing the pace, the very pushiness can have the opposite effect. A client signed up with me recently, and her comment, I often ask people what prompted your decision. Sometimes they volunteer it, but I tend to ask, you know, when you decided to go ahead as opposed to not go ahead, what was it that prompted your decision? She said, you weren't pushing me. And I thought that was quite enlightening because pushiness tends to have the opposite effect. The more we push for an answer, the more we offer special discounts if you sign up by the end of September, which is Friday, the more that can smack of desperation, and actually we end up postponing the decision rather than accelerating the decision that we wanted to do. Okay, 10-2. Got a few minutes for questions or comments. Or Carmen, anything to add on to what I've just been waxing lyrical about?
No, I think some of the key learnings for me I've shared already, and I would be very keen to hear what other people's experiences are.
Yeah. Feel free to use the chat box, folks. I thought you were all seeing the chat box, but perhaps you're not. Bridie is asking, any tips on how to push back on urgent work without escalating? Well, I don't know if you like this one, Bridie, but I have a fairly straightforward tip on urgent work, which is I tell clients I just don't do it. You know, my focus is on quality work, not urgent work or cheap work. So if you're looking for either urgent or cheap, then you know, I'm probably not the right person. If you're looking for a training program next week, the chances are I'm just not available. So some people might find that a little bit pushy, but actually you'll probably find nice language to do it, like how busy you are. And again, it makes, you see, one of the ways that we show we're ahead of the client is show that our allegiance is to quality work. I think that stands us well in terms of trust and in terms of credibility with the client. So I make no apology for saying, look, I stand for quality work as opposed to hurry work or cheap work. I'm not even pretending otherwise. Magnus, who is the guest on the next call in October, is going to be talking more about this. Being very clear about what you stand for and what you stand against is important. So I'm not sure how would you respond to that, Carmen? The question was how to respond to a client who's looking for urgent.
So yeah, I think that I've tried the quality argument and it works. I also think, above all, is you being prepared to walk away from a project. Perhaps something that we haven't said explicitly, and it's linked to us having enough opportunities on the table. But inevitably, when at the beginning of this year, for example, I felt a couple of big projects had finished at the same time. I hadn't done my business development. I think the reality is, sometimes it's easy to say yes to things. Inevitably, a lot of the projects that had an urgent timeline, your work doesn't really deliver the quality that you are expecting, and they end up being quite short-lived. Meaning that you do the project, but that's the end of that relationship. When things are not urgent, it can easily lead into an ongoing relationship with a client, which is more rewarding for the client, but it's certainly more rewarding for me.
Yeah. And perhaps to add to that, I would say to Bridie, highlight the risks of doing things in a hurry. The risk of doing this without proper preparation is we don't get the response that we're expecting. Again, sometimes people don't get the virtues of quality, so I talk to them about the consequences of lack of quality. That is usually gets their attention. So sometimes people who don't get the quality argument need to be hit over the head with the absence of quality argument and some of the specific ways in which that can impact reputation, impact costs, impact timelines, impact careers sometimes. Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in that I probably won't be able to respond to on the call, but I will do my best to get back to you individually. So if I haven't addressed something that you've just pressed enter on, then we will go through these get collected up into an email to me at the end of the call. So I'll come back to some of you individually. And if you can't wait for that, you can book yourself in. In fact, some of you probably have, even while I'm talking. So we're trying this out, a bit like Demio polls. So wish me luck or wish yourself luck. But if you look on www.talktojohnnyland.com, you will hopefully see a booking mechanism that is live. I don't know what happens if 50 people descend on the same time slot in the same minute, but let's find out, shall we? Some people use the discovery call to work on practical tips. Maybe the very question that you're just emailing in, you might want to discuss over a 30-minute call. Very happy to do that. Some want to deal with more strategic questions, as I think Carmen did about 6 months ago. Some just want a sounding board on a specific issue, which was a call I did yesterday. Whatever it is, you're welcome. There are time slots open usually on Tuesdays and Thursdays because I reserve other days for other things. Help yourself. And the next webinar on this series is on October the 17th, which is all about the fee questions and the fee setting questions. That's it, folks. Big thanks for Carmen for giving us specific examples and for not only contributing to the content of today, but the human preparation as well. I think a lot of what we're doing here, as you will almost certainly have noticed, is looking at how we build better business relationships. When we have long-term relationships with good clients, with people who really trust us, with whom it's a pleasure to go to work, then it meets that criteria of inspiration rather than perspiration. Sure, there'll be tough days, there always are. There'll be days when we have to run to meet a deadline, but let's at least make sure it's for a client that's worth it and that it's worth putting in that effort for. So if any of those themes chime with you and you'd like to talk about them individually, then there'll be a link sent straight after the call. Thanks everyone for your participation, and I'll wish you a very good afternoon. This is me trying to figure out how to end the webinar. End webinar.